Thank you so much, Rob, and all of you who have made this possible, and those of you who are here to share in this today. So I will introduce, I'm very glad to be able to welcome Natalie Watson Singleton as this year's Compassion Lecturer. She is a licensed clinical psychologist as well as an associate professor of psychology at Spelman College. She's also the Diversity and Inclusion Education Director with the NIA Project at Emory University Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, and brings some of the expertise that she'll speak to from her experiences there. Her strong identification as a clinical community psychologist, actually trained in the program that I came from before here, is reflected in her scholarship, teaching, and clinical and community work, with research focused on understanding how racism-based stressors influence African Americans, and specifically African American women's health disparities, as well as best practices for culturally modifying mind-body interventions to enhance engagement and reduce these adverse health outcomes among diverse populations, which is just a much needed task within our field. She's published numerous empirical research articles and received federal grant funding from National Institutes of Health for her research on these topics. Her work has also been recognized by professional societies such as the American Psychological Association, the Association of Black Psychology, Association for Women in Psychology, and the Society for Science of Clinical Psychology. Natalie's larger aim, which these marks of acclaim suggest is already being realized in meaningful ways, is to produce research that is translational and can bridge science and practice to improve the lives of marginalized communities. And for me as a researcher, Natalie's work has filled some important gaps that I've become more and more aware of in our growing understanding of how principles and practices associated with mainstream mindfulness and compassion can and cannot be applied to BIPOC communities who have been marginalized in our society and suffered some of the greatest harms. And helping us to inspire efforts to rethink how our research, prevention and intervention programs that we develop can best meet those who are suffering the most from stress-related illness and ill-being. I'm looking forward to hearing more of her insights for this key growing edge for the mindfulness movement and how we may integrate these into our ongoing work as a community with her talk, making room for our voices, centering African Americans in mind-body intervention research and practice. So welcome, Natalie.
Thank you. I'm extremely excited to be here. I don't take it for granted that you all thought enough of me and my work to invite me out here. It's always wonderful when the work that I do is resonant with the community of folks. And so thanks to each and every one of you all who showed up today. So I like to move, and I'm realizing my shoes are kind of loud. So I'm going to try to balance that by trying not to move too much to interfere with the information that I want to share. So I want to just start with acknowledging the work or the funding that supported this work, funding that started with being awarded to Dr. Angela Rose Black, that was utilized for some of the qualitative work that I'm going to talk about, as well as some of the funding from NIH that I'll be talking about later in today's talk. So in terms of the structure of this presentation, my plan is to only spend about 45 to 50 minutes talking to you all. I don't want to be too long-winded because I want to make sure that we have ample time for conversation, comments, questions. But what I would like to highlight is just to tell a little bit about what brought me to this work. To provide an overview of the literature that really grounds this work and why I see this work as meaningful, to talk about 3 particular studies that I have undertaken to try to address the glaring gap in our research as it pertains to making mindfulness accessible to diverse communities. And I want to also then critique my own work from an intersectionality or Black feminist perspective perspective to really highlight where else we can go from here. And then hopefully to have some closing remarks and again, ample time for conversation and questions. So my entrance into mindfulness or this scholarship really started as someone who was committed to health equity as a graduate student. So when I got to graduate school at the University of Illinois, I was really interested in trying to understand the factors that contributed to adverse health for African Americans and things that we could do as clinical community psychologists to ensure, as best as possible, that African Americans had equitable access to living long and healthy lives. Then in my third year of graduate school, as I was sharing with some folks earlier today, I went on my first mindfulness retreat because I was going to be teaching mindfulness at our Psychological Services Center as a graduate student. And I remember being immediately struck by just the power of mindfulness and how transformative it was in my own life. And I was also struck by just the absence of folks of color that showed up to our mindfulness sessions at the Psychological Services Center when we started offering them. The other thing that was also going on for me is my lived experience as a Black identified multiracial woman. I was very aware of, again, all of the good that mindfulness could do for me in my community, and all of the ways in which the sort of white-centric packaging of mindfulness in the US was also off-putting. And so all of these things that I had to look over or sort of bypass to be able to engage in mindfulness, and wondering if that was part of the reason why we weren't seeing folks of color engage in our mindfulness groups. And again, that intellectual curiosity of, if we provided mindfulness to folks of color, would they show up? Do they have an interest? And if they're not showing up, what can we do about it? So it's these things that really allowed me to get into this space, or that spurred my interest and motivation in this work. So I don't want to assume that everybody has a working understanding of what mind-body practices are or interventions are. And so according to the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine, mind-body interventions are practices that incorporate interactions among the brain, mind, body, and behavior with the intent to use the mind to affect physical functioning and promote health. And there are a variety of mind-body interventions, as you can see here: yoga, acupuncture, breathing exercises, and Tai Chi. The mind-body intervention that I specifically focus on in my work is mindfulness, which really is about paying attention to the present moment in a non-judgmental and curious way. And mindfulness has, when I think about sort of mindfulness, it has both the formal practice of mindfulness, but also the ways in which we incorporate this present-focused attention into our everyday lives. So really supporting folks in being able to do the formal practice, whether that's the breathing exercise or the body scan, but also supporting them in being able to just bring increased present-focused attention into their daily lives. As many of us may know, there is a lot of good that mindfulness does. There's work that shows that it decreases depression, decreases anxiety, improves blood pressure. It targets a lot of the things that African Americans have disproportionate rates of. And so it almost seemed like a simple solution, right? Like if African Americans have elevated blood pressure, have increased somatic complaints, increased chronic pain, and mindfulness can help reduce those things, then what can we do to use mindfulness to engage communities of color, particularly African Americans? And yet, when we think about who mindfulness is for, these are typically the images that are out there promoting who mindfulness is for. And so if we look at these messages, what are some things that we might infer? Not rhetorical, Would you say? White women. And a particular type of white woman, right? Sort of thin, blonde. The idea that mindfulness is supposed to make us sort of bliss out. And again, it's for a particular segment of the population. And so when I think about my own entrance into mindfulness, not really seeing myself reflected in actual mindfulness spaces, but also even in the images about who mindfulness was for. The research also highlights that not only is there a problem with sort of the messaging around who mindfulness is for, we also see that communities of color are largely absent also from the research. So mindfulness has grown in increasing popularity in the research scholarship. And there was a study done by a team of folks in 2018 that looked at MBSR specifically, so mindfulness-based stress reduction. And what they wanted to do is to see, out of the articles that specifically studied MBSR, what was the representation of diverse groups. And they located 69 articles total that specifically looked at MBSR. And of those, African Americans made up about 11% of the population in those studies, Latinx populations about 4%, and so on and so forth. I remember presenting this finding in a grant application, and a reviewer said, well, that's not problematic. African Americans are only 12% of the population. So of course they should only be about 11% of the studies. My thinking is, well, if African Americans are disproportionately represented in terms of adverse health outcomes, they also need to be disproportionately represented in the work that we're trying to do to solve these adverse health outcomes. So going beyond MBSR, there was a study that was done by some additional colleagues that said, let's not just look at MBSR, but let's look at mindfulness in general. And what they found is that between 1990 and 2016, over 12,000 studies looked at mindfulness in some way, shape, or form. Any guesses on how many specifically focused on folks of color or had a diversity focus?
25.
25, okay. One. We have some cynics in the room, okay? Yeah, 300? 100? 24? I have no prize. 24 studies included a diversity focus, and specifically the diversity focus was they specifically focused on a particular racial or ethnic group. Only 3 studies implemented a cultural adaptation, which means only 3 of those tried to do something to the mindfulness program to make it fit. 2 of those 3, the adaptation was simply offering it in Spanish. So not changing the content in any way, not changing the curriculum in any way, but simply offering it in a language to make it viable or accessible to the community of interest. So again, a lot of work that needs to be done when we're thinking about how to engage communities of color. So why might cultural adaptations be needed? And I get this question a lot, like, well, what's wrong with our current mindfulness program? Why is it insufficient? Well, Lau, I think, makes a wonderful case for why we might care or why we might need to culturally respond or culturally tailor an intervention. And Lau says there's evidence or there's a need for a cultural adaptation if there is important variability or important difference across groups in terms of contextual processes that influence vulnerability to target problems. Well, if we think about African Americans, are there unique risk factors? Yes, race-related stress, racism. living in a society in which you are constantly being bombarded with microaggressions, overt racism. And so, if our intervention does not specifically account for those unique risk factors and how those risk factors may be impacting your health, we're potentially missing the mark. Lau also argues that if there's important difference or variability in terms of contextual processes that influence protection, meaning are there unique protective factors, then there might be a need for cultural adaptations. And if we think about African Americans in particular, there are various culturally relevant protective factors, such as spirituality, such as social support, communalism, kin networks. And does our existing mindfulness curriculum really sort of maximize those? And then, is there evidence that the response to existing strategies for the target problem vary? And if we think about African Americans, yes. African Americans are less likely to engage in mental health services for reasons such as cultural mistrust. Why engage in a setting or in an intervention for healing if that same setting or intervention has also been used in my oppression, right? And there's a whole long history of mistreatment of African Americans when engaging in the healthcare system. So why would I trust this particular health intervention or resource? And so if our existing mindfulness programs aren't accounting for things like cultural mistrust, again, we may be limited in our ability to engage and retain African Americans. So I want to talk about the first study that started to try to address, well, if there's evidence that we need culturally tailored mindfulness interventions, what kinds of adaptations might be warranted? And so this is a study that was published in 2019. And we used Briggs' mental health utilization logic model to kind of guide our research questions and analyses. So according to this model, if we want to eliminate health disparities, we have to increase individuals' engagement in interventions or services that can reduce adverse health. And in order to increase their engagement, then there are things that we can do to target the intervention itself, things that we might want to target things outside the intervention but that are still relevant, such as where the intervention is located. And there may be certain individual factors that we have to consider. And so using this model, the three research questions that guided our work were: what modifications to internal factors might need to be provided? What modifications to external factors might need to happen? And are there any adaptations we can make to reduce those individual level barriers or factors? So for this particular intervention, it was a 4-week intervention that was adapted based on MBSR. So we worked with 2 certified MBSR instructors to say, how do we take the existing 8-week intervention, reduce it to 4 weeks, to provide to the women who would be participating. One of the things about this is because we were asking about recommendations for adaptations, we did not adapt on the front end. Although we thought adaptations would be needed, we really wanted to treat it like an empirical question. So let's offer the non-adapted version and see what Black women say, whether or not they feel like adaptations need to take place at the internal level, the external level, and at the individual level. So that 4-week intervention included some of the key components of MBSR, such as the body scan, breathing practices, awareness of thoughts and feelings, and they were all sent home with the MBSR CD to facilitate at-home practice. The only, I guess, adaptation we made is we felt strongly about the facilitator being African American. That if we were going to engage Black women for 4 weeks, we wanted them to be in a space where they were going to be in a setting with someone who understood their lived experience. So 7 women completed the 4-week intervention, which took place in Dade County, Wisconsin. The ages for the women range from 38 to 65. All of the women had children. 80% were college educated. 1 out of 7 never married, and 1 out of 7 unemployed. So after the 4-week intervention, we invited women to participate in a focus group about their experience. The focus group lasted about an hour and a half, and here were some of the questions that we asked women. So how do you see any of the practices we've learned helping some aspect of your life? If you think about our families and communities, is there anything about the 4-week series that wouldn't work or fit with us? And if you were in charge of running this mindfulness training series specifically for African Americans, how might you change it? And again, these are just some of the sample questions that were used to facilitate the conversation in the focus group. And of course, women had lots of recommendations. They did not feel the non-adapted version worked. So there were several recommendations for internal modifications. All of the women emphatically believed that the facilitators needed to be Black, that they needed to be folks who understood their lived experience so that there were certain things they did not have to explain. It's like, I don't want to have to come in and explain what a microaggression is. I don't want to explain why someone asking to touch my hair is a problem. That they wanted someone to come in there not only with the knowledge of mindfulness, but a knowledge of who's in the room. Women also felt that there needed to be more explicit connection between mindfulness and its principles and the values within the African American community. So if we think about a value of inner strength, how does mindfulness connect to this or not? If we think about a value around spirituality, how does mindfulness connect to this or not? If we think about resilience, how does mindfulness connect to that or not? And making those connections clearer. Also, I think the utilization or the conversation around other folks in the community who have mindfulness practices. So communicate to us that this is not something totally unfamiliar, but that there are folks in our community doing this work. They also recommended switching out the terminology for terminology that was familiar. One of the ways in which this was most pronounced was in the use of the word meditation. Women did not agree or did not like the utilization of the term meditation, particularly in a non-church context. They say, you know, when we're at church and you're telling us to meditate, like meditate on God or meditate on scriptures, like that has a clear meaning. But if I'm not in a church context or I'm not at a church group and you're asking me to meditate, what is it are you really asking me to do? And concerned that somehow they were being invited to open themselves up to spirits or forces that were against their religion. And then also recommending that the resources were culturally tailored for them. And one of the ways in which this was most pronounced was with the CD. And I was sharing this with some folks earlier. So we sent them home with the standard MBSR CD to facilitate at-home practice. And the women strongly disliked it. They said, the last thing we want to do when we get home at the end of the day is listen to a white voice telling us what to do. Right? It's like, I don't want to go home. It's like, I have to listen to white folks tell me what to do at work, at school. I don't want to have to get home and then listen to a white voice tell me to close my eyes. And that they were actively going against the instructions of the CD, almost like an active like resistance, racial resistance, and against oppression. And so all of this stuff was getting stirred up in them because of the voice on the CD. Women did not have a preference, whether it was a Black man or Black woman voice. Women were like, can you get Morgan Freeman to do the voice? I was like, I don't know if I have the budget for Morgan Freeman, but you know. So again, the idea that they wanted voices that felt familiar to them culturally. Women also had recommendations for external modifications, particularly situating the intervention within places that they already frequent. Put the intervention in our church. Put the intervention in our community center. So the Boys and Girls Club, the YMCA, the African American Cultural Center, the places where we already are, put it there as opposed to putting it in your outpatient clinic, your primary care clinic, your mental health clinic. And women had a lot of reasons for this. One that primarily stood out was that if the intervention is located in our places and spaces, it means that it's been accepted by our gatekeepers. Like if our pastor has allowed this intervention in our church, it must be okay. And so feeling like situating the intervention within their community places and spaces lended it a certain credibility, communicated that this intervention is okay to participate in. This is a safe intervention. This is an intervention that's been vetted. And then some individual level barriers that women felt were important to address were things such as religious concerns. So there were a lot of questions about, is this a Buddhist practice? Can I practice it if I'm not Buddhist? If I'm Christian, is it antithetical to my beliefs? So being clear about where mindfulness comes from. Can you practice it if you're not Buddhist? In what ways is it aligned with your existing spiritual practices? They also talked about accentuating the benefits beyond health. Tell me how this practice is going to help me show up for my family and community better. Like, what's in it for me to like give you 4 weeks of my time? How does it help me, again, show up for my community and do what I need to do for my community? And they also felt strongly about underscoring the holistic health. So not focusing too much on mental health, but talking about how mindfulness can benefit sort of holistic health, right? So how can it help you manage your blood pressure, manage your diabetes? Yes, deal with stress, but not leaning too much into talking about depression and anxiety for fear that that would stigmatize folks or raise questions about, well, if I do this thing, are people then going to think I'm depressed and anxious? So just a summary. Did women think that the existing intervention worked? No. That there were several changes that needed to be made for it to be appropriate for our communities. And just in terms of some limitations, there were, a small sample size. I think it's wonderful that 7 women committed to 4 weeks of this work. And I think there's continued need for additional qualitative work with larger samples. And then just wanting to note the lack of diversity of the women in terms of socioeconomic status, age, gender identity, and so on. And so the second study I want to talk about really is about kind of where my work is currently in terms of how I've leveraged the qualitative work to create something that really also tries to address the accessibility barriers to accessing in-person interventions. So if we think about sort of the growing interest in tech and being able to leverage technology to be able to meet the health needs of our communities. One of the questions that I often get is thinking about tech or using tech appropriate for African American communities? There's actually research that shows that most African Americans own a smartphone, and work that shows that for African Americans, technology can be used to actually empower health-related behaviors. I don't know if you all are familiar with the research that also talks about sort of the types of overt and covert racism African Americans deal with when they go into hospital settings. And so, right, like having their doctors invalidate their pain or think that they're exaggerating or underreporting their pain or trying to engage in problematic health-seeking behaviors. And so for a lot of African Americans, being able to access health information via the phone kind of saves them from those racist interpersonal interactions. And so there is work to suggest promise with being able to leverage technology to engage African Americans in health-related practices and services. And I think one of the things that particularly interests me is how technology, particularly mHealth applications, can address accessibility barriers that disproportionately impact communities of color. Right? So if we think about technology such as apps, they're generally low cost, right? So it's not about whether or not you have adequate insurance or not. They're widely available and sometimes easy to use. And again, I think reduce those barriers that African Americans, those unique barriers that African Americans have to face when they're navigating healthcare contexts. And so what we did is myself and my technology collaborators, we took the qualitative information that we had and used it to create an app called Blackfulness. And as you can see, the app has different tabs, such as practices. As you can see, all of the images are African Americans, which is in direct conversation to that image that I showed you previously, right? So this is not the app that you open up and you only see thin, blonde, white women, right? This is an app where you open up and you see folks who reflect the members of your community. It also has educational videos such as what is stress, what are emotions, what are thoughts, how does mindfulness align with your cultural practices, in what ways can you incorporate present focused attention into your daily life. And then opportunities for them to track their mood, to also journal about their experience, engaging in the practice as well. So all of the practices were guided by African Americans, again, in response to what folks told us. They didn't want a white voice telling them what to do, so they weren't going to have to deal with that with this app. The content was also informed by Afrocentric principles and culturally relevant theories. And so one of the things that I was sharing with the group earlier is how this work has also, I think, introduced me to the ways in which mindfulness is very much a part of our indigenous African practices, right? There are ways in which it maps onto sort of traditional West African practices, particularly of Mayat. Mayat was a ancient Egyptian goddess that stands for balance. So if we're talking about balance, the ways in which mindfulness can help us sort of balance or bring harmony to the mind and the body, that they are not separate, but that they are interconnected. Truth, if we think about sort of acceptance, seeing things as they are for what they really are, and then again, making these connections explicit based on what folks shared in the qualitative literature. Also incorporating the theories of Afrocultural coping, race-based trauma. So if I think about one of the practices that was written and created was specifically called I Can Breathe, which was in direct response to the protests of I Can't Breathe, right, that emerged following Eric Gardner's passing. So what does it mean to invite Black folks to pay attention to the breath? And during a time when so many of our community members are having their breath cut short due to state-sanctioned violence, if we think about the disproportionate response to COVID and how that impacted our communities. And so naming that experience explicitly and talking about how it is both an honor to still be connected to our breath and how we can breathe for the ones that we've lost. So again, incorporating those values, incorporating those experiences, those sociocultural realities into those practices. I don't know if you all have heard the hashtag Black Boy Joy or Black Girl Magic. So even having a guided practice that's centered around cultivating joy and joy as an act of resistance. What does it mean to live in a society wrought with oppression and still take 5 minutes, 10 minutes and cultivate joy and be attuned to joy? And so what we did is, and This process was an iterative process, so every image, the practices were constantly, we were constantly seeking feedback from participants along the way. We then tested the app in a pilot study using a within subjects pre-post design, in which we wanted to see if there were changes in a 2-week period, particularly if folks reported reductions in stress, if they reported a better ability to manage their emotions, and if they reported increased use of mindfulness. So 39 participants completed. Originally, there were 71 folks enrolled in the study. However, let's see, 32 did not complete, either did not initiate the app or did not complete the study measures. And so if they didn't complete all of the study measures, we didn't have their data to use. However, there were no significant differences between those who completed all of the study measures and those who didn't. The average age was 31. Most of the participants were women, were employed, and had heard about mindfulness. And our hypotheses were supported. So we noticed reductions in stress. We also noticed increased use of mindfulness behaviors and reductions in difficulties regulating their emotions, which is what we want to see, right? So the way in which we measured emotion regulation was like difficulties regulating your emotions, and what we saw is that people reported fewer difficulties regulating their emotions. And so we had some preliminary evidence to suggest that our app was doing what we set out to do, that it was reducing stress, it was improving emotion regulation, and folks were actually engaging in more health-related behavior, mindfulness. However, we didn't have a control group, which raises questions really about the internal validity of the study, right? So are these changes due to the app, or are they simply due to the kinds of changes we would expect to see naturally in a 2-week period? And so to address that limitation, study 3 performed in RCT. And so using funding from our phase 2 grant, we used a repeated measures randomized control trial design in which we had an intervention condition and a waitlist control. And what we wanted to see is, would there be differences in the folks who were in the intervention condition, meaning the folks who used the app, versus those who didn't have the app in terms of stress, emotion regulation, mindfulness. And here we added self-compassion. So in terms of the sample size, we had 170 participants with the intervention condition being 84 folks, the waitlist control being 86 folks. The mean age, slightly older than the previous study, so about 36. Much more balanced in terms of gender, at least between men and women. Most had heard about mindfulness, most were employed, and most were single. We did not see change or differences in stress. So although we do see directional improvements, right? So people are reporting less stress, it didn't significantly differ across the treatment and control. So that hypothesis was not supported. Similarly, our hypothesis was not supported for emotion regulation. What we do see, though, is that folks in the treatment condition are reporting more self-compassion than those in the control, and those in the treatment condition are reporting more mindfulness behaviors than those in the control. Which is interesting, because I'm like, if folks are using more compassion and more mindfulness, why aren't they less stressed? One of the things that we're wondering about is if the time of data collection really impacted these findings. So like a lot of folks, we were stuck collecting data during COVID. So we started our data collection in the fall, I believe, of 2020 through sort of spring, summer of 2021. And so I wonder if we might have seen more robust reductions in stress had we done the study at a different time, or perhaps for a longer period of time. So although folks were engaging in more self-compassion, engaging in more mindfulness, the way in which COVID impacted all of us, but particularly Black communities, if like mindfulness can only do so much, right? And I think one of the things that I'm continuously thinking about is how might the app impact culturally relevant social determinants of health. So not just stress generally, but race-related stress. So my engagement in the app reduced reports of the stress associated with experiencing racism. And so I want to just provide some additional considerations from an intersectionality perspective and then open it up for comments and questions. So intersectionality really was birthed out of the writings of Black feminists. Black feminists who were asking the questions or who were paying attention to, if we think about sort of the women's rights movement, there's a way in which white women's needs are really being prioritized in that movement. If we think about the civil rights movement, there are ways in which Black men's needs are being prioritized. But what about those folks who occupy multiple marginalized identities? What about their experiences? And so in 2009, psychologist Elizabeth Cole really put forth some important analytic or methodological questions for those of us who care really about making sure that those who occupy multiply marginalized identities are being centered within our work. And one of the questions that she asked is, when you're looking at your work, it's important to interrogate that work and ask who's included and who's excluded. And then asking yourself why. What were the series of decisions that arrived at certain folks being included and others being excluded? And so if I think about this work, yes, filling an important gap in terms of culturally adapting mindfulness to be available to Black Americans, but really interrogating who is the app for? Who's best served by the app? Are there folks that we're missing? And so I think some areas for continued work as we're continuing to do research on the app is how might this app meet the needs of African Americans with elevated symptomatology or not? So if I think about some of the work I do with the NIA project at Emory, I work with individuals, African Americans who've attempted suicide in the last year. Would this app be appropriate as a standalone treatment for them, or might it not meet their needs? What about folks with disabilities? What about African Americans who occupy other marginalized identities, recognizing that even within the African American community, we are not a monolith. There's a lot of diversity. And again, continuing to ask the question of who is our work for? Who does it best serve and who does it least serve? And then the second question Cole invites us to consider is, what role does inequality play? Because when we're talking about intersectionality, it's not just about identity, intersecting identities. It's about intersecting or interlocking systems of oppression. And how does inequality shape who has access to these interventions, who has access to the app or not? And I think the other thing that I constantly think about is I think mindfulness is one tool to help African Americans deal with the reality of oppression, but we also need to end oppression. We need to end racism, right? We need to create a world in which race-related stress is no longer a reality. So in what ways, if any, can we use this work in the service of informing social change agendas, movements, and policies? And so again, I think much to be done in this space as well. I just want to highlight some additional resources for those of you all who might be interested in this work more. There was a book that came out, I think last year, called Beyond White Mindfulness. And again, the critique really is of the white-centric mindfulness that has emerged in the US. My colleague Angela Rose Black and I have a chapter in here, but there's some other fascinating work in here about what folks are doing to really bring mindfulness to various minoritized populations. And then I want to acknowledge that I am in good company. I am not the only person doing this work, but wanting to shout out the other Black women who are doing this work, such as Dr. Shelley Harrell, who has created Soulfulness, which is a mindfulness approach that really leans in to the wisdom and practices of folks across the African diaspora. Dr. Michelle Chapman, who is the founder of the Black Mindfulness Summit. Some of you all might be familiar with Dr. Candace Hargens out of Kentucky, who created the Black Lives Matter meditation that I think is free and available online. And so just wanting to highlight the community of us who are doing this work. If you're interested in the app, it's available. So if you have an Android or iPhone, you are more than welcome to download the app. If you're just curious, you can download the app. If you want to share it with friends, colleagues, clients, we welcome you to download that as well. And just to acknowledge, again, the team of folks who helped collaborate on this work and who made this work possible. Without further ado, we'll turn it over to questions and comments. Thank you.
So I found here, especially the findings you had about stress not changing, really interesting. And I actually, you were talking about time of year, like it made me think of some of my own work with people who are in highly stressful positions. And when asked with like intimate accessibility, they basically said that they did not actually work with mindfulness that helped with their stress. So I wonder whether or not it's possible that maybe it's not about helping reduce the stress, but just change their relationship.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful insight. So I think the question or comment was, is it really about reducing stress? Should that be our goal, or helping or supporting people in changing their relationship to stress? I think the thing that I am encouraged by is the increase in these, I think, helpful or adaptive health behaviors, right? So yes, they may not be reporting reductions in stress, but if they're more compassionate on the other side of it, if they're using practices like mindfulness to take care of themselves, I think that's a win as well. Yeah.
So thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I found myself thinking about the issue of gender in detective studies in general. I think we all know that in any gathering it's mostly women. And I was interested in your RCT where you actually had a large group of African American men. So I guess I had a couple of questions. I wondered if you had had a chance to look at your impacts moderated by gender.
We did, and didn't see gender differences in that regard. Yeah.
Okay. And I wonder if you've thought about, or what you think about, you've done such a careful analysis of thinking about African American women and their needs vis-a-vis mindfulness and how to think about it and language it. And I wonder if you've thought about that in relation to African American men.
Yeah. So the study one, definitely African American women at the app development stage, and I didn't go into those data as much in terms of the qualitative data that we collected as part of the app development included African American men. So getting feedback on languaging. So one of the things that some of our African American men participants talked about is not really resonating with the language of self-care. So that was the other language that was provided, like should we call it meditation or just call it mindfulness? Do we talk about self-care? And the men overwhelmingly feeling like self-care is like, that's a women's word, that's a women's term. And so talking about things like being in flow, which was language that was more consistent with sports or athletics, having more examples and the images of Black men having some of the motivational talks and practices that were being provided, offered by Black men mindfulness instructors. So that was some of the feedback that we did get, yeah.
I have kind of a two-part question. So I work as a minister. I work in ministry as a minister. So I have two. One, I related to when you brought up the women's reaction in the first study to feeling like, what am I letting in? I'm used to meditating in church, but not in an ulterior setting. Because that's a feeling I've had when I've practiced mindfulness in my infancy stages, like, is this okay? But, so I guess one question is, have you studied like Christian, because there are Christian forms of meditation like Lectio Divina that have been around for centuries, and how that might impact, like, and I love that you said when it's done in churches, it gives credibility, and it's something we've done in our churches. We've incorporated mindfulness practices at church, and our church is very diverse. That's my second part of the question is, how do you practice as a non-African American person? How do you practice in a way or share it, or how can I make it accessible without it being offensive or like not helpful? So, because obviously that was something that they shared in that first study too, that it wasn't, or even in sharing the app, like how could I do that in a way that would be helpful?
So in terms of the first question, I have not formally studied Christian mindfulness. I'm aware of it. And because just sort of the nature of a lot of the African Americans in our study who identify as Christian naturally incorporate some of that language from Scripture. So thinking about the Scripture of like, be still and know that I am God, like having that being one of the verses that anchors the practice and highlighting how practices of stillness are very much aligned with a Christian tradition. In the app, though, we had folks ask for more spirituality-focused practices, but wanted them general enough so that regardless of your spiritual tradition, you could participate. And so for those practices, we'll invite people to think about their spirituality or their spiritual values. What's a word or a phrase that means something to you spiritually, and allowing that to be the anchor of attention, trying to keep it general in that regard. To the second question of what you can do, I think if there are folks of color in the community who do this work, inviting them into the space. I think if that's not a possibility, leaning into the written work by folks of color who have done this work. So I think about sort of Audre Lorde. I think about, so even some of the text messaging that we included in the app were all sort of quotes from African Americans. And so even starting out a conversation with a quote from an African American writer or celebrity to sort of anchor the conversation, to highlight that you're aware that this is also a part of our practice. And my sense is that introducing the app, if you're worried about like, because I also think about, like, as a psychologist, we pay attention to cultural competency, right? Part of, we want to be aware of cultural difference, and we also don't want to stereotype. There's Dr. Sue talks about this phrase of dynamic sizing, which is this idea of recognizing that there may be this value or worldview that's important to a particular cultural group, but you need to appropriately size it based on the person in front of you, right? That there's individual difference on how much we might adhere to a particular value or worldview in our community. And so one way to do that is to offer the app alongside other apps, right? So like, oh, here's Calm, or here's Headspace, and here's Blackfulness, because I don't want to assume that that was the other thing. The folks who were most likely to use the app consistently also rated themselves as high on ethnic identity. So these were folks who were very strongly identified as Black, which not all Black folks are, right? And so allowing for that possibility could be offering the app alongside other apps. Yeah.
So looking along with this conversation about intersectional identities, I'm just curious if you have any ideas on how we can better include mindfulness and these practices for LGBTQ people, and especially LGBTQ people of color.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and I think something that we're thinking about and considering, particularly if I think about one of the workshops that I went to that was particularly talking about trans individuals, thinking about sometimes perhaps not wanting to make assumptions about the body scan engagement, like how engaging with the body in a particular way, or just sort of assuming that the traditional body scan fits someone who, for a variety of reasons, might be struggling in their relationship with their body, or have discomfort around the body. Like, how do we support that? So I think there's a lot of work to be done there. Yeah. Yes.
Great talk.
Thank you.
So trauma is a big issue here, and trauma and use of apps is something that people raise concern about because they aren't with you when they can't express themselves in a way or share in the moment. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, and whether we have implications for this that's people that actually get worse or doing an app like that, or they don't get worse, but they just turn off it. I mean, a lot of people start with apps and they don't. I'm just wondering, like, trauma history might predict not using the app, for example, or even having an app.
Well, I think that's a wonderful question and observation. And I think it goes back to that question again of who is the app for, who's best served by the app. Because I think about even some of the work that I've done clinically. As part of the NIA project, we had sort of a yoga and mindfulness group for women, all of whom had significant trauma histories and really struggled with the yoga and mindfulness group. And I think part of it was that there wasn't enough support and facilitation around, I think, when to engage and disengage, ways to take care of yourself if you notice yourself being activated. One of the things that we did do with the app is we have several educational videos about the different kinds of reactions someone might experience when engaging with the app, particularly trauma, and naming trauma specifically. And we have a video around like grounding techniques. If you start to feel yourself disconnecting from the body or disconnecting from the present, what are other ways to ground yourself? Giving yourself permission to stop. When might it be time to seek out additional resources? But you're right. I think there is a limitation in that regard. Yes.
First, I just want to make a comment. I really appreciate the trajectory, how you started with the qualitative, designed your app, and then did a pilot in RCT. That's a really nice just trajectory of the research. But my question is about something completely different. A number of us in this room actually do interventions with children, and I'm wondering if you have that kind of added layer of developmental difference. Do you have any experience or even just ideas about adaptations that are appropriate when we think about working, with children, adolescents in a variety of culturally, that would be culturally adaptive?
Yeah. No. It's like knowing when to stay in your lane. I am absolutely. This is an adult app, right? Like, it was not intended to be an app for all of that variability across the lifespan. Dr. Michelle Chapman, who I mentioned on one of the previous slides, who created the Black Mindfulness Summit, does a lot of work around Black youth. And so I know that she's been working on some things related to culturally responsive mindfulness for Black youth, and more power to her. Yeah.
Just a practical question. I assume the app is free. Is it free?
Yes.
Okay. And then I was just wondering, in your qualitative study, right, it was really talking about how the women weren't doing, or the things they found problematic about engaging with it, right? But they did try to engage with it, right,
Yes.
for the 4 weeks. Did you have by any chance like, any data similar to the study 2 where you saw pre-post changes? I'm just curious, because you could think that it's not great or that you don't want to engage with it, but it could still be beneficial. So I'm just wondering if there's anything like that with that first study. Or even qualitatively, whether or not they felt any improvements, you know, even with the limited engagement component.
Yes, they did. So for a lot of the women feeling immediately following the practice, most of them would talk about, oh, increased relaxation. Oh, I want to try this more. Some of that was complicated, I think, by other sort of cultural messaging that Black women received, because there was also this concern, well, if I'm too relaxed, I can't show up for my community, right? Like there's a way in which it's hypervigilance, right? Relaxation goes against this need to be hypervigilant to ensure that my family and my community are good. So there was some of that tension. Women also reported, I think, just an increased sense of like self-empowerment. Like now I have skills and tools that I can use to take care of myself. Women talked about how they were sharing these skills with their kids, with their parents who lived in their home. And so, yes, qualitatively, there were these improvements. Going back to the first question about is the app free, it is. And one of the things, so how the NIH structure is set up, there's the phase 1, which is funded, the phase 2, which is funded, and the phase 3, which is commercialization, which is unfunded. And what's been interesting is, as a researcher, thinking about sort of the science of this work, the accessibility of this work, and then when you're trying to commercialize a product, what does that mean for like a subscription-based, like all of these things that get introduced to the picture when you're trying to think as a business person as opposed to an academic. So I think that's a tension that we're talking through. So I wanted to be transparent about that. Yeah. Other questions or comments?
Well, I want to cut things off, but I also know we've given you a full program, and we do provide your information, so it sounds like you're open to folks following up
Yes.
in the future. And I think we can go ahead and thank you. So I just, want to thank you again on behalf of all of us here, for coming and sharing your wisdom, your knowledge from all this work you're doing, and helping, I know, inspire many of us to go forward and try to use some of these pieces and these seeds that you've sown of, how can we realize some part of this in our work and in our lives. So I appreciate that.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And I also want to thank, again, to acknowledge all of those who have made this possible, including, beyond those who have already been named, the leadership of the Prevention Research Center, Greg Fosco and Stephanie Manza here. Also all the support people at the Prevention Researcher, Carol Masulo, Glenn Rhodes, Sarah Brennan, who really helped kind of put this together, realize it as an actual thing. And also the donors and benefactors who have provided the financial support that really allows this to happen. And they ask not to be named here, but we know and can acknowledge and appreciate their generosity and how that helps to support this ongoing building work that we're trying to engage in together. So the last thing that I'll do is present you, I don't know if I'm supposed to open it up, but I'll go ahead and show it. We have as a commemorative kind of thank you for Natalie to bring, and probably Sarah's ready with it.
Taking up from
It's from commemorating this lecture at this moment in time, and who else should be? Yeah, we can start
Here.